Imagine you are 25 years old, educated, beautiful, and rich. You leave your family's townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan on a freezing December morning in 1910, carrying $30 in cash and wearing a black fox muff with white points. You buy chocolates. You buy a book. You speak briefly to a friend on Fifth Avenue, and then you walk into the crowd and you are never seen again. No body, no note, no answer. For over 100 years, not a single soul has been able to say what happened to Dorothy Arnold. But here is the stranger truth. She was not the only one who vanished. In an era when the law erased women's identities through marriage, 3 women exploited that same fragile architecture of selfhood to erase themselves entirely. One used silence, one used fire, one used fraud, and together, they proved that Gilded Age identity was never a fact, but a performance that anyone could end. Chapter 1: The Law That Made Women Disappear Before They Chose to. Before a single woman in this story vanished, the law had already erased her. In 1765, the English jurist William Blackstone wrote a sentence that would govern American women's lives for the next century and a half. He wrote that in marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law, and that person is the husband. He called this principle coverture. The word comes from the French, meaning to cover, to hide, to make invisible. And that is precisely what it did. When a woman married, her legal identity did not merely change, it ceased to exist. Think about what that meant in practice. A married woman in 1870 could not sign a contract. She could not keep the wages she earned. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sue. She could not be sued. She could not make a will without her husband's consent. The money she brought into the marriage, the dowry her father had assembled, became her husband's property the moment the vows were spoken. If she inherited land from a relative, it passed immediately to his control. If she worked as a seamstress or a teacher, every dollar she earned belonged to him by law. The architecture was total. A woman's legal existence was not reduced, it was absorbed. She became, in the language of the courts, a femme covert, a covered woman, hidden beneath the legal shadow of her husband's name. And the system was not some relic of medieval England clinging to life in the New World. It was actively enforced by American courts, American banks, and American legislatures well into the 20th century. The reformers fought back, and they fought for decades. Mississippi passed the first Married Women's Property Act in 1839, and New York followed in 1848. State by state, the laws changed. By the 1880s, most American women could technically own property in their own names. But the gap between the law on paper and the law in practice was vast. Banks still demanded a husband's signature. Employers still paid wages to the man of the house. Credit in a woman's own name remained almost impossible to obtain until Congress passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974. That was the year Richard Nixon resigned. That was how long it took. So when we speak of women who disappeared in the Gilded Age, we must begin with this. The system had already made them invisible. Coverture was not merely a legal inconvenience. It was a machine for erasing personhood. And the 3 women at the center of this story each discovered, in her own way, that a system designed to make you vanish can also be turned to your advantage. If you do not exist as a legal person, then there is nothing to hold you in place, no record to anchor you, no identity the state can confirm or deny. Consider the numbers. In 1850, roughly 3 million married women lived in the United States. Under coverture, Not one of them could independently sign a lease, open a bank account, or retain a lawyer. 3 million women, invisible in the eyes of the law, walking through a country that claimed to be founded on liberty. Their husbands controlled approximately $500 million in combined assets that those women had brought into their marriages, dowries and inheritances transferred by operation of law, not by choice. And the enforcement was not abstract. Courts routinely sided with husbands who seized their wives' earnings. Banks refused women's signatures on documents. When a woman named Myra Bradwell applied to practice law in Illinois in 1873, the Supreme Court of the United States denied her. Justice Joseph Bradley wrote in his concurrence that the natural timidity and delicacy of the female sex evidently unfitted it for many of the occupations of civil life. This was not a fringe opinion. It was the law of the land, written by the highest court in the nation, 30 years before Dorothy Arnold was born. The question this story asks is not why these women disappeared. It is why we are surprised they did. The law had already taught them how. Chapter 2: The Heiress Who Kept a Secret Post Office Box. Dorothy Arnold had everything a young woman of 1910 was supposed to want, except permission to be herself. Her father, Francis Arnold, was a perfume importer whose fortune placed the family firmly in the upper reaches of New York society. They lived in a brownstone at 108 East 79th Street, between Park and Lexington Avenues. Dorothy was listed in the Social Register, that slim volume that served as the official census of old money, New York. She had attended finishing school. She had studied at Bryn Mawr College, one of the most prestigious women's institutions in the country. She spoke French. She traveled to Europe. She wore the right clothes to the right dinners and smiled at the right people. And she lived a double life. Behind the performance of the obedient daughter, Dorothy Arnold was a writer. Not a woman who dabbled in verse at parties, but a serious, ambitious writer who wanted to publish fiction. She kept a secret post office box where she received correspondence from magazine editors. She submitted short stories under her own name to McClure's magazine, one of the most important literary publications of the era. She wrote constantly, privately, with an intensity that suggests she understood writing was not a hobby. It was the only version of herself that felt real. Her family did not approve. Francis Arnold believed that a woman of Dorothy's station did not publish stories in magazines. In a publication was a public act. It drew attention. It invited scrutiny. It suggested that the Arnold family's wealth and social position were not sufficient to keep their daughter content. For Francis, Dorothy's literary ambitions were not merely inappropriate. They were an insult to everything the family had built. Dorothy pushed back in the only ways available to her. She pawned jewelry to fund her independence. Small amounts at first. A brooch here, a bracelet there. The cash gave her breathing room. She rented the post office box. She carried on a relationship with George Griscom Jr., an older man her family considered unsuitable. She met him in secret. She wrote him letters the family never saw. And she asked for one thing. She asked her father for permission to take an apartment in Greenwich Village, the neighborhood south of 14th Street, where artists and writers and radicals were building a world that had nothing to do with the social register. Greenwich Village in 1910 was cheap, chaotic, and alive with exactly the kind of people Francis Arnold did not want his daughter to know. He refused. The answer was absolute. No daughter of his would live alone in the village. No daughter of his would live alone at all. We do not know exactly what Dorothy felt when the answer came. We know she did not argue. She did not make a scene. She continued to attend dinners. She continued to smile. She continued to submit stories to magazines. In the fall of 1910, McClure's rejected her most recent submission. It was the 5th or 6th rejection in a row. She told a friend that the rejection was the end of all her literary hopes. 6 weeks later, she was gone. But the rejection alone does not explain what happened. Thousands of writers are rejected every year and do not disappear. What made Dorothy Arnold's case different was the totality of the cage. She was wealthy enough to see the world she wanted, but not free enough to enter it. She had the education to write, but not the permission to publish. She had a lover, but not the right to choose him. Every door she tried to open was locked from the outside by someone who claimed to love her. And so she walked out of the house on a December morning with $30 in her pocket. She bought chocolates at Park and Tilford. She bought a book of essays at Brentano's. She ran into a friend named Gladys King on Fifth Avenue and spoke to her briefly about the weather. And then Dorothy Arnold stepped into the crowd and was never seen again. But the family's response to her disappearance would prove almost as disturbing as the vanishing itself. Chapter 3: A Comely Widow and the Queen of Ohio. While Dorothy Arnold quietly suffocated in silk, 2 other women were already rewriting the rules of who they were allowed to be. In 1884, a 24-year-old Norwegian immigrant named Brynhild Paulsdatter Storseth arrived in the United States. She would become Belle Gunness. But that name, like everything else about her, was a construction. She stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds, with a round face and small, careful eyes that people remembered long after they forgot what she had said. She settled first in Chicago, where she married a man named Mads Sorensen. Mads died in 1800. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. He died on the only day when 2 life insurance policies overlapped, meaning Belle collected on both. The payout totaled $8,500. In today's money, that is roughly $300,000. If this seems suspicious, it is because it was, but no investigation followed. Belle was a widow. Widows suffered. The insurance company paid. She used the money to buy a farm in LaPorte, Indiana, 40 miles east of Chicago. She married a second husband, Peter Gunness. Peter died in December of 1902. The official cause was a sausage grinder falling from a shelf and striking him on the head. Belle collected another $4,000 in insurance. Peter's death was barely cold when Belle placed her first personal advertisement. The ads appeared in Scandinavian-language newspapers across the Midwest. A comely widow, she wrote, who owns a large farm, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided with a view to joining fortunes. Object: matrimony. The wording was precise. She was not looking for love. She was looking for men who had cash and were willing to bring it with them. They came, one after another, and they never left. 1,000 miles to the east, another woman was conducting a different kind of campaign. Her name, at birth, was Elizabeth Bigley, and she was born in 1857 in Eastwood, Ontario, to a family of modest means. By the time she was 22, she had been arrested for forgery. By 25, she had been committed to an insane asylum. By 30, she had served time in prison in Toledo, Ohio, for a scheme involving a fake inheritance. And by 35, she had shed Elizabeth Bigley entirely and become someone new. She called herself Cassie Chadwick. The name had no history and no meaning. That was the point. She married a Cleveland physician named Leroy Chadwick, whose respectable name gave her the one thing she needed: credibility. Dr. Chadwick did not know that his wife had been a forger, a confidence artist, and a convicted felon. He knew only that she was charming, well-spoken, and ambitious. That was enough. Cassie's genius was understanding that wealth, in Gilded Age America, was not a number in a bank account. It was a performance. It was the way you dressed, the way you spoke, the carriage you rode in, and the names you dropped. And the biggest name she could drop was Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in America. In 1897, Cassie arranged to be seen entering Carnegie's mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York. She had a lawyer named Dillon with her, a man she had recruited for precisely this purpose. When she emerged from the mansion, she was carrying a piece of paper. She dropped it. Dillon picked it up and glanced at it before handing it back. It appeared to be a promissory note signed by Andrew Carnegie for $2 million, payable to Cassie Chadwick. The note was a forgery. Cassie had never met Carnegie. She had simply walked into the mansion, likely chatted with a servant, and walked back out with the paper she had written herself. But Dillon did not know this, and Dillon talked. Within weeks, bankers across northern Ohio had heard the rumor. Cassie Chadwick was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had acknowledged her privately. He had given her a promissory note worth a fortune, and the bankers, dazzled by the proximity to Carnegie's name, began to lend. Identity in America, these two women had discovered, was not a birthright. It was a costume. And if you wore it with enough confidence, no one would ask to see what was underneath. Bell's farm was humming with suitors. Chadwick was emerging from Carnegie's mansion, claiming to be his daughter. Both women had found the seam in the system. What happened next would prove just how far that seam could be torn. Chapter 4: The country where nobody could prove who they were. In 1895, a woman could board a train in New York and step off in Chicago as someone who had never existed before. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of how identity worked, or rather did not work, in Gilded Age America. And understanding the infrastructure of that failure is essential to understanding how Dorothy Arnold could vanish without a trace, how Belle Gunness could kill and escape, and how Cassie Chadwick could borrow millions on a lie. There were no Social Security numbers until 1936. There were no standardized birth certificates until 1902, and even after that, compliance was spotty at best. As late as 1940, an estimated 55 million Americans had no birth certificate at all. That is more than 40% of the population walking around with no state-issued proof that they existed. Think about what this means. If you wanted to verify that a woman named Cassie Chadwick was who she claimed to be, where would you start? There was no national database. There was no photograph on file with the government. There was no credit report, no Social Security record, no centralized index of American citizens. The census came once a decade and recorded whatever name you gave the enumerator. If you moved between states, you simply announced yourself. I am Mrs. Chadwick. I live in Cleveland. My husband is a doctor. That was your identity. It was what you said it was. The banking system operated on the same principle. A letter of introduction from a known associate was often all that stood between a stranger and a line of credit. If a respectable lawyer told a banker that his client was Andrew Carnegie's natural daughter, the banker had no practical way to disprove it. He could not telephone Carnegie. He could not run a background check. He could write a letter, but letters took days, and in those days the money might be lent and spent. For women, the system was even more porous. A woman's name changed when she married. If she married again, it changed again. A widow who remarried and then moved to another city could have 3 different names attached to 3 different lives, and none of them would be cross-referenced anywhere. The boarding houses of New York and Chicago were filled with women who lived under names that appeared on no registry, on no tax roll, and no voter list, because women could not vote. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was the closest thing America had to a national investigative body. Founded in 1850, the agency maintained files on known criminals and offered its services to banks, railroads, and private citizens. But the Pinkertons were expensive. A basic investigation cost $5 a day, roughly $150 in modern currency. A case that spanned multiple cities could run into the hundreds, sums that most individuals could not afford. And even the Pinkertons relied on physical descriptions, not photographs, not fingerprints, not dental records. A woman who changed her hair, lost weight, and adopted a new name could walk past a Pinkerton detective and never be recognized. The missing persons infrastructure was equally primitive. There was no national missing persons database until the FBI established the National Crime Information Center in 1967. Before that, a missing person report filed in New York had no connection to a report filed in Indiana. If Dorothy Arnold walked into a boarding house in Philadelphia and gave a false name, no alarm would sound, no wire would be sent. She would simply become someone else. Fingerprinting existed as a concept, but its adoption was glacial. Scotland Yard began using fingerprints for identification in 1901. The New York City Police Department did not establish a fingerprint bureau until 1904, and even then, prints were only taken from convicted criminals. There was no fingerprint on file for Dorothy Arnold, for Belle Gonesse, or for any law-abiding citizen. Photography was similarly limited. Mugshots existed for criminals, but there was no system for photographing ordinary people for identification purposes. Passports did not require photographs until 1914. A driver's license in the states that required them at all was a slip of paper with a name on it. No photograph, no physical description, just a name that anyone could write. The railroads compounded the problem. In 1910, the American Rail Network covered over 240,000 miles of track. Over 1 billion passenger trips were taken annually. No ticket required identification. You walked to the window, paid your fare in cash, and boarded. And you could buy a ticket to San Francisco under the name Mary Smith, and no one would ever connect you to the woman who had left New York as Dorothy Arnold. The distance between 2 lives was nothing more than a train ticket and a new name. The scale of this anonymity is staggering. Consider the numbers. In 1910, the year Dorothy Arnold disappeared, New York City had a population of roughly 4,800,000 people. The police department employed about 10,000 officers. That is 1 officer for every 480 residents. The Detective Bureau was even smaller, perhaps 200 men tasked with investigating every crime in the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. A single missing woman, even a wealthy one, was a needle in an ocean. Yet women's boarding houses charged between $2 and $5 per week. That is between $60 and $150 in modern money. For that price, a woman received a room, 2 meals a day, and absolute anonymity. The proprietors of these houses did not ask for references. They did not ask for identification. They asked for rent in cash, paid weekly. A woman with $30 in her pocket could vanish into one of these houses for a month, and no one would know she was there. This was the country these 3 women lived in. A country where your name was whatever you said it was. Where your past existed only if someone remembered it. Where a woman could step off a train and become anyone or no one with nothing more than a new hat and a confident voice. The architecture of disappearance was not something they had to build. It was already there, built into the gaps of a nation that had never bothered to keep track of its own people. All they had to do was walk through the door, and all three of them did. Chapter 5. The Men Who Came to the Farm and Never Left. Belle Gunness did not merely place personal advertisements. She wrote invitations to a grave. The system she built was elegant in its cruelty. The advertisements appeared in Scandinavian-language newspapers, the Scandinavian in Chicago, the Decorah Posten in Iowa, and smaller papers scattered across the upper Midwest. Belle wrote in Norwegian, targeting a specific population: immigrant men who had worked hard, saved money, and were lonely enough to answer a stranger's advertisement. The typical ad read like a business proposal dressed in the language of romance. A comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with a view of joining fortunes. She sometimes added that triflers need not apply. She was not interested in men who wanted to court her. She was interested in men who would bring cash. The requirements were specific and non-negotiable. Each suitor had to visit in person. Each suitor had to bring his savings in cash or easily liquidated form. Belle explained that she needed a partner who could demonstrate his commitment by contributing to the farm's operations. The logic sounded reasonable. The farm needed capital. Marriage was a financial partnership. A man who could not contribute was a man who was not serious. They came by train. They arrived at the LaPorte station carrying their life savings. Some brought a few $100s. Some brought thousands. They were met by Belle or by her hired hand, Ray Lamphere, and driven to the farm on McClung Road. The property was 48 acres of flat Indiana farmland with a 2-story brick house, a barn, a carriage house, and a hog lot. The men were welcomed, they were fed, and then they were killed. George Barry arrived with $1,500 in cash. He was never seen again. Herman Konitzer came with $5,000. He vanished. John Moo brought $1,000. Ole Boodsberg, reportedly $2,000. Olaf Lindblom, amount unknown. The names and numbers accumulated like an accountant's ledger written in blood. The most heartbreaking case was Andrew Helgelian. Andrew was a farmer from Aberdeen, South Dakota, who had spent years saving money. He liquidated everything. He sold his farm, his equipment, his livestock. He converted his entire life into cash and traveled to LaPorte in January of 1908, carrying approximately $3,000. He had been corresponding with Belle for months. He believed he was going to marry her. Andrew's brother, Asle Helgelian, knew about the correspondence. He knew Andrew had gone to Indiana, and when the letters stopped coming, Asle began to ask questions. Belle's method of disposal was grimly efficient. The bodies were dismembered and buried in shallow graves around the farm. Some were burned. Some were fed to the hogs. The hog lot at the Gunness farm became, in the aftermath, one of the most notorious crime scenes in American history. The investigators who dug up the property would eventually recover remains from at least 11 bodies. Some estimates run as high as 40. The money flowed through Belle like water through a sieve. She deposited funds at local banks under various pretexts. She paid off the mortgage on the farm. She bought new equipment. She dressed her children well, She maintained the appearance of a prosperous widow managing a thriving agricultural operation. The total amount she extracted from her victims is estimated at between $50,000 and $100,000. Adjusted for inflation, that is between $1.5 million and $3 million in today's currency. But the scale of her crimes was hidden by the very anonymity that defined the era. These were immigrant men. Many spoke limited English. Their families were in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark. When a letter stopped arriving, the family might wonder, but what could they do? Write to the LaPorte police? Describe a man they had not seen in years? Hope that someone in Indiana cared about a missing Norwegian farmer? No one cared, not until Asle Helgelian refused to stop asking. The mechanics of the operation revealed themselves in the details that emerged later. Belle's kitchen, where she cooked meals for her suitors and her children, was also where she prepared the poison. Strychnine was available at any pharmacy, sold without prescription as a rat killer. A large woman who ran a farm had every reason to buy it. The druggist in LaPorte never thought twice. Belle also kept chloroform, which she used to subdue her victims before the killing. The combination was efficient. A drugged man does not struggle. A poisoned man does not scream. The disposal required physical strength, and Belle had it. She was a powerful woman who had done farm labor for years. She could swing an axe. She could carry a body. She could dig in the frozen Indiana soil until the grave was deep enough. Some of the bodies were found wrapped in oilcloth. Some were found in burlap sacks. The graves were shallow, rarely more than 3 or 4 feet deep. But on a 48-acre farm with no neighbors close enough to watch, shallow was deep enough. Belle also made careful use of the legal system. She visited a lawyer in LaPorte in late March of 1908 and made out a new will. She told the lawyer that she feared for her safety. She said Ray Lamphere had threatened to kill her and burn the house down. The lawyer noted her concerns and drew up the document. In retrospect, the visit appears to have been part of the plan. If the fire happened and Belle was found dead, the will would point the investigation at Lamphere. The scapegoat was prepared before the match was struck. In the winter of 1908, Asle wrote to Belle directly. He asked where his brother was. He asked why Andrew had not written. Belle replied that Andrew had left the farm months ago. She did not know where he had gone. The answer did not satisfy Asle. He wrote again and again. Belle could feel the walls closing in. The questions were getting sharper. Asle was talking about coming to LaPorte himself. And there was another problem. Ray Lamphere, her hired man, the one person who knew what was buried in the yard, was becoming erratic. He drank. He made threats. He told people in town that he knew things about Belle that would make their hair stand on end. By April of 1908, Belle Gunness had a decision to make. She could wait for Asle Helgelian to arrive and start digging. She could wait for Ray Lamphere to talk. Or she could do what she had always done when a situation became unmanageable. She could disappear. What she did next was either the act of a desperate woman or the final stroke of a genius. But either way, it began with 2 purchases made on the same afternoon, toys for her children and a large can of kerosene. Chapter 6. $2 million built on a single lie. Cassie Chadwick's genius was understanding that a lie big enough becomes its own proof. The principle is counterintuitive, but devastatingly effective. A small lie invites scrutiny. A woman who claims to have $1,000 in the bank might be asked to prove it. But a woman who claims to be the illegitimate daughter of the richest man in America, that claim is so enormous, so audacious, so far beyond the ordinary range of deception, that it creates its own gravity. No one questions it because no one can believe someone would dare to invent it. This was Cassie's weapon, and she wielded it with a precision that left the banking establishment of Northern Ohio in ruins. The scheme began with the visit to Carnegie's mansion in 1897 and the forged promissory note. But the note was only the seed. The real genius was in the cultivation. Cassie did not rush to the banks with her forgery. She let the rumor spread. She let Dylan, the lawyer, tell one person, who told another, who told a banker, who told another banker. By the time Cassie walked into her first bank, the story had acquired the weight of common knowledge. The first major loan came from the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, Ohio. The president of the bank was a man named Charles Beckwith. He was a respected figure in the community, a church deacon, a man of apparent sobriety and judgment. Cassie approached him not as a supplicant, but as a woman of enormous private wealth who needed a discreet financial partner. She showed him the forged promissory note, $2 million signed by Andrew Carnegie. She explained, in confidence, that she was Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. Carnegie had acknowledged her privately, but could not do so publicly without scandal. The note was her inheritance, held in trust. She needed short-term loans to manage her affairs until the note matured. Beckwith believed her. He did not telephone Carnegie. He did not write to Carnegie's attorneys. He did not consult with other bankers. He simply lent her the money, and then he lent her more and more. Over the course of several years, Charles Beckwith loaned Cassie Chadwick approximately $800,000. His bank's total capital was roughly $250,000. He had loaned her more than 3 times everything his bank possessed, and Beckwith was not alone. Bankers across northern Ohio competed for the privilege of lending to Cassie Chadwick. Irie Reynolds at the Wade Park Banking Company in Cleveland, the Lincoln National Bank, the Savings Deposit Bank. In one institution after another, extended credit to a woman whose entire claim to wealth was a piece of paper she had written herself. The total amount Cassie borrowed was approximately $2 million. In today's currency, adjusting for inflation, that is roughly $72 million. $72 million, borrowed on nothing more than a 20-minute visit to a mansion she did not belong in and a forged signature she had produced at her kitchen table. And she spent it. She spent it with the velocity of a woman who knew, perhaps at some level, that the money was borrowed time made tangible. She bought diamond necklaces by the dozen. She purchased 8 grand pianos and gave them away as gifts to friends and associates. She bought a gold organ for her home. Her Cleveland mansion was renovated overnight, rooms torn apart and rebuilt to her specifications. She maintained 30 closets filled with clothing, furs, and accessories. She traveled first class. She threw lavish dinner parties. She employed a staff of servants who wore uniforms she had designed herself. The spending was not merely extravagant, it was strategic. Every diamond necklace, every piano, every gold-trimmed dinner plate reinforced the story. A woman who spends like Carnegie's daughter must be Carnegie's daughter. The consumption was the proof. The lie fed itself. But every Ponzi scheme, and that is what this was in its essence, requires new money to cover old debts. Cassie borrowed from new banks to pay interest to old ones. She rolled loans forward. She promised future payments backed by the Carnegie note that would never mature because it did not exist. The house of cards stood for nearly 7 years. It stood because no one wanted it to fall. The bankers who had lent her money could not afford to discover the truth. If Cassie was a fraud, then they were fools, and worse, they were fools who had gambled with their depositors' savings. It was in everyone's interest to believe. The collapse began in November of 1904, when a Boston banker named Herbert Newton demanded repayment of $190,000. Newton was not from Ohio. He had no social relationship with Cassie. He had no reason to extend her courtesy. He wanted his money. Cassie could not pay. She tried to borrow more, but the dam was cracking. Newton filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit became public. And suddenly, every banker in Ohio who had lent Cassie Chadwick money found himself staring at a very simple, a very devastating question. Had anyone, at any point, actually verified the Carnegie note? The answer, of course, was no. No one had checked. No one had called. No one had written. For 7 years, millions of dollars had flowed on nothing more than a rumor, a forged signature, and the absolute conviction that a lie that big could not possibly be a lie. The unraveling would be swift, spectacular, and merciless. But before it was over, Cassie Chadwick would teach the American banking system a lesson it would spend a century trying to forget. Chapter 7. The morning she walked into the crowd and never came back. December the 12th, 1910, was 21 degrees in Manhattan, and Dorothy Arnold left the house without a coat heavy enough for what she was about to do. We know what she wore. We know it because her family, after weeks of silence, would eventually describe the outfit to investigators with the obsessive precision of people who had memorized every detail while refusing to act on any of them. She wore a blue skirt suit, a black velvet hat trimmed with blue silk roses, the black fox muff with the white points, low-heeled shoes. She carried a small handbag. She left the brownstone on East 79th Street at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. The family said she was going shopping. That was the performance. The dutiful daughter running errands, nothing unusual, nothing to alarm anyone. Her first stop was Park and Tilford, the confectioner on Fifth Avenue. She bought a box of chocolates. The purchase was later confirmed by the store's records. Her second stop was Brentano's, the bookshop at 27th Street and Fifth Avenue. She bought a copy of a book called An Engaged Girl's Sketches, a collection of light essays. This purchase, too, was confirmed. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she encountered a friend named Gladys King walking along Fifth Avenue near 31st Street. They spoke briefly. Dorothy mentioned nothing about any plans. She said nothing that Gladys would later describe as unusual or alarming. It was a conversation about weather, about shopping, about nothing. And then Dorothy Arnold walked south into the crowd. That is the last confirmed sighting. She was 25 years old. She had $30 in her purse. She was carrying chocolates and a book, and she stepped off the edge of recorded history as cleanly as if she had stepped off a cliff. What happened next was not a search. It was a cover-up. The Arnold family did not contact the police. Not that day, not the next day, not the next week. For 6 weeks, Francis Arnold concealed his daughter's disappearance from the authorities and the public. He hired private investigators from the firm of J. Kearns. He contacted the Pinkertons. He sent inquiries to hospitals and morgues, but quietly, always quietly. At one point, the family's attorney told a reporter that Dorothy had returned home safely, a statement that was entirely false. 6 weeks, 42 days. In that time, a woman could travel from New York to California and back twice. She could board a steamship and reach England. She could check into a boarding house in any city in America and establish herself under a new name with no questions asked. Every hour the family waited. Every day they chose reputation over rescue. The trail grew colder. When the family finally went to the police in late January of 1911, they did so reluctantly. They did so because the Pinkertons and the private investigators had found nothing, and the pressure of knowing was becoming unbearable. The police, now working with a 6-week-old case, had very little to work with. No witnesses had seen Dorothy after Gladys King. No body had been found. No ransom demand had been received. The family's priorities were laid bare by their actions. Francis Arnold was not primarily concerned with finding Dorothy. He was concerned with controlling the story. A missing daughter was a scandal. A daughter who had run away was worse. A daughter who had disappeared under circumstances that might suggest a secret lover, or a pregnancy, or a suicide was unthinkable. Better to manage the narrative in private. Better to keep the investigators quiet. Better to lie to the press than to admit that a daughter of the Arnold family had simply walked away. The police investigated. They followed leads. They interviewed George Griscom in Italy, where he was traveling. Griscom claimed he had not seen Dorothy and knew nothing about her whereabouts. He was never formally cleared, but no evidence ever connected him to her disappearance. The theories multiplied: suicide in the East River, a botched abortion, murder for the $30 in her purse, though this seems unlikely given the absence of any evidence. An intentional disappearance, planned and executed with the same meticulous care Dorothy had applied to her double life. The family offered a reward of $1,000. Tips poured in from across the country. None led anywhere. A woman matching Dorothy's description was reported in a hotel in Providence, Rhode Island. It was not her. A woman was seen boarding a steamer in Baltimore. Not her. A body washed up on the shore of the East River. It was not Dorothy. Each lead opened and closed like a door to an empty room. The Pinkertons worked the case for weeks. They tracked George Griscom across Europe. They interviewed servants, friends, shopkeepers, and boarding house owners. They found nothing. The agency's files on the case eventually ran to hundreds of pages. None of them contained an answer. The press, once it learned of the case, was merciless. Headlines screamed about the missing heiress. Reporters camped outside the Arnold brownstone. Francis Arnold, the man who had kept his daughter's disappearance secret for 6 weeks, now found himself at the center of exactly the kind of public spectacle he had spent his life avoiding. He gave statements that were terse, evasive, and contradictory. He hired more investigators. He threatened reporters with lawsuits. Nothing worked. Dorothy's face was in every newspaper in New York, and still no one came forward who had seen her after that afternoon on Fifth Avenue. The case settled into the peculiar limbo of unsolved mysteries, too famous to forget, too cold to solve. But one detail haunts the story more than any other. Before she disappeared, Dorothy told a friend that after her latest rejection from McClure's, she had burned all her manuscripts, every story, every draft, every word she had written in secret, every page she had hidden from her family. She burned them all. Was this the act of a woman preparing to die? Or was it the act of a woman preparing to become someone else? Someone who needed no connection to the girl who wrote stories in a brownstone on the Upper East Side. The fire consumed the pages, and then the city consumed Dorothy, and the Arnold family was left with a silence they had chosen and a question they could not answer. Chapter 8: A Headless Body and a Can of Kerosene. On April the 27th, 1908, Belle Gunness bought toys for her children and a large can of kerosene, and both purchases made perfect sense. The toys were for her 3 children. Belle was, by all external appearances, an attentive mother. She dressed her children well, fed them well, and kept them in school, and the kerosene was for the farm's lamps and stoves. A 48-acre property consumed fuel. No shopkeeper thought twice about either purchase. That night, the Gunness farmhouse caught fire. The blaze was visible for miles across the flat Indiana countryside. Neighbors arrived to find the house fully engulfed. By the time the flames were extinguished, the structure was gutted. In the basement, searchers found 4 bodies, 3 children and 1 adult woman. The children were identified as Belle's. The adult body was presumed to be Belle herself. Case closed. A terrible accident. A family destroyed. Except the adult body had no head. This was the detail that turned a tragedy into a mystery that has never been solved. The fire had been intense, but human skulls are among the most durable bones in the body. The children's skulls were recovered intact. The adult body's skull was missing entirely. The body was also smaller than Belle's known measurements. Belle Gunness stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. The body in the basement was significantly lighter and several inches shorter. The authorities arrested Ray Lamphere, Belle's former hired hand. Lamphere had been recently fired. He had been making threats. He had been seen near the farm on the night of the fire. The case against him seemed straightforward, but what he told people in whispers and coded admissions was far more disturbing than simple arson. According to witnesses who spoke to Lamphere before his death in prison, Belle had not died in the fire. She had planned the entire thing. She had traveled to Chicago days before and hired a woman, perhaps lured her and brought her back to the farm. She had killed this woman, placed her body in the basement, and removed the head to prevent identification. She had set the fire. She had walked away with her money. If this account is true, then Belle Gunness killed her own children. This is the darkest corner of the story, and it resists easy explanation. Some historians argue that Belle would not have killed her children. Others point out that Belle had already murdered at least 11 people for profit, and that her children were potential witnesses to decades of killing. The digging began the next morning. Assel Helgalian had arrived in La Porte. He had been writing to Belle for months, demanding to know where his brother Andrew was. Now he demanded that the police excavate the farm. They did. The first body was found within hours, then another, then another. The remains were scattered across the property in shallow graves, in the hog lot, beneath the chicken coop. Some bodies had been dismembered. Some had been burned with quicklime. Some were little more than bone fragments and teeth. The investigators eventually recovered remains from at least 11 victims. Some estimates, based on the volume of bone fragments and the number of missing persons connected to the farm, placed the total as high as 40. The farm became a spectacle. Within days, the La Porte Daily Herald reported that as many as 15,000 people had visited the farm. Vendors set up concession stands along McClung Road, selling lemonade and sandwiches to the crowds. Souvenir hunters picked through the debris, taking chunks of brick and charred wood as keepsakes. Photographers sold postcards of the excavation, some showing the open graves, others showing the piles of bone fragments laid out on sheets for identification. What had been a place of murder became a carnival, a macabre tourist attraction that the local newspaper called the worst sight in Indiana. The smell was terrible. Investigators worked with handkerchiefs over their faces. The soil around the hog lot was saturated with organic material. Every shovel of earth revealed something: a button, a tooth, a fragment of cloth, the corroded remains of a pocket watch. The possessions of the dead men surfaced in the dirt like artifacts from an ancient burial ground, except these men had been alive within living memory. Their families were still waiting for letters that would never come. Lamphere was tried for arson, not murder. The prosecution could not definitively prove that the headless body was not Belle, which meant they could not definitively prove she was alive, which meant they could not definitively prove Lamphere had not killed her. The legal tangle was absurd and illustrative. In a country without reliable identification, even a body in a basement could not prove who it was. Lamphere was convicted and sentenced to prison, where he died of tuberculosis in 1909. On his deathbed, he reportedly told a fellow prisoner and the prison doctor that Belle had indeed planned the fire. She had killed a substitute and fled with approximately $7,000 in cash. But where did she go? The question has never been answered. No confirmed sighting of Belle Gonesse was ever recorded after April of 1908. In the rubble of the farmhouse, investigators found 2 dental plates that supposedly belonged to Belle. But the plates were found sitting on a pile of debris in suspiciously good condition, as though they had been placed there rather than subjected to the fire. A gold tooth that Belle was known to possess was never found in the remains. Belle Gonesse had done what Dorothy Arnold would do 2 years later. She had walked into the darkness and refused to come back. But while Dorothy vanished as a question, Belle vanished as a horror. Somewhere in America, a woman who had killed at least 11 people was living under a name no one knew, in a town no one suspected, with money she had taken from the dead. And for 3 decades, people would keep looking for her. Chapter 9. The Queen of Ohio in a Money Belt. When the police arrested Cassie Chadwick in New York, she was wearing over $100,000 in cash strapped to her body. The money belt was the final, absurd detail of a life built entirely on performance. Even in the moment of her arrest, Cassie was carrying the props of her character. $100,000. In 1904, that was enough to buy 40 houses. It was strapped to her body in a belt that must have weighed several pounds, pressing against her ribs as the officers led her away. The collapse had been swift. Herbert Newton's lawsuit in November of 1904 set off a chain reaction that destroyed everything Cassie had built. When Newton filed, the lawsuit became public. Other creditors saw the filing and panicked. If Newton was demanding repayment, then maybe Cassie could not pay. And if she could not pay Newton, then she could not pay anyone. The banks began calling in their loans. Erie Reynolds at the Wade Park Banking Company demanded his money. The Citizens National Bank of Oberlin demanded its money. One institution after another lined up with its handout, and for the first time, Cassie had nowhere to turn. The system that had sustained her, the system of whispered rumors and unverified claims and borrowed money covering borrowed money, required forward motion to survive. The moment it stopped, it collapsed under its own weight. The forged promissory note was examined. Experts confirmed what should have been obvious from the beginning. The signature was not Andrew Carnegie's. It was not even a competent forgery. Carnegie himself was contacted and issued a statement that was devastating in its simplicity. He said he did not know Cassie Chadwick. He had never met her. He had no illegitimate daughter. The note was a fraud. 7 years, $2 million, $72 million in today's money. All of it built on a piece of paper that no one had bothered to verify because the lie was too big to question. The press descended on the story with the ferocity that only a scandal involving money, sex, and stupidity can generate. Reporters dug into Cassie's past, and the identities began to unravel. Cassie Chadwick was Madame Lydia DeVere, a clairvoyant from Toledo who had been arrested for forgery. Madame Lydia DeVere was Elizabeth Bigley, a Canadian woman who had been committed to an insane asylum and served time in prison. A lifetime of identities, layered one on top of another like coats of paint on an old wall, was stripped away in the space of weeks. The trial took place in Cleveland in March of 1905. The courtroom was packed every day. Reporters from newspapers across the country filled the gallery. Cassie arrived in court wearing expensive clothing, maintaining the performance even as the performance was being exposed for what it was. She sat upright. She watched the witnesses. She showed nothing. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. Cassie Chadwick had used forged documents to defraud banks of millions of dollars. The victims included not only the banks themselves, but their depositors, ordinary men and women, widows and orphans, who had entrusted their savings to institutions that had gambled everything on a con artist's word. The prosecutors paraded the numbers before the jury, or 800,000 from Beckwith alone, 190,000 from Newton, tens of thousands from smaller banks and individual lenders. The total was staggering. The betrayal was total. The defense attempted a strategy that was cynical even by the standards of Gilded Age courtrooms. Cassie's lawyers argued that she was a helpless woman who had been victimized by the bankers themselves. The bankers had pressed the money on her. The bankers had failed to verify her claims. If anyone was at fault, it was the men who had been so eager to profit from her supposed connection to Carnegie that they had abandoned their fiduciary responsibilities. The argument contained a grain of truth, which made it all the more uncomfortable. Charles Beckwith had lent 3 times his bank's capital to a single borrower without verification. That was not merely foolish, it was a violation of every principle of sound banking. The bankers were victims, yes, but they were also willing participants in a fantasy that served their greed as much as it served Cassie's. The jury deliberated and returned guilty verdicts on 7 counts of fraud. The judge sentenced Cassie to 14 years in the Ohio penitentiary. In the courtroom, Cassie displayed no emotion. She had spent a lifetime performing, and even the verdict was just another scene in a play that had finally reached its last act. Charles Beckwith did not survive the scandal. The Citizens National Bank of Oberlin collapsed. Beckwith was indicted for misusing bank funds and died before his trial could begin. The bank's failure wiped out the savings of families across Lorain County. A small town's economy, built over generations, was destroyed by one man's refusal to ask a simple question. The verdict stripped away Cassie's last assumed name. In the records of the Ohio Penitentiary, she was not Cassie Chadwick. She was not Madame Lydia DeVere. She was Elizabeth Bigley, inmate number 4307, born in Eastwood, Ontario, convicted of fraud. But even the prison records were performing an act of fiction. Because the woman behind all those names was not really Elizabeth Bigley either. She was something more frightening. She was proof that identity, in America, was a story that anyone could tell and anyone could end. Chapter 10. The Detective Who Solved the Case, and then unsolved it. In 1921, a New York police captain announced that Dorothy Arnold had been found, and then he refused to say where. It's Captain John Ayers had been assigned to the Arnold case for years. He was a dogged investigator who had chased leads across the country and into Europe. He had investigated George Griscom. He had checked hospitals, asylums, and morgues. He had followed tips that led to dead ends in Philadelphia, Chicago, and rural Pennsylvania. And then, in 1921, 11 years after Dorothy's disappearance, Ayers told reporters that the case was closed. He had found her. She was alive. And then he said nothing more. The Arnold family was furious. They demanded details. Ayers refused. He said that revealing Dorothy's location would compromise her privacy. He said she had asked not to be found. He said the matter was settled. The department backed him up. No further information was released. Was he telling the truth? The question has been debated for a century. Some historians believe Ayers did find Dorothy and honored her wish for anonymity. Others believe he was lying, that he had hit a dead end and invented a resolution to close the file. Still others suggest that he found evidence of her death, perhaps a suicide or a death during a medical procedure, and chose to spare the family the details. The theories about Dorothy Arnold are numerous, and none are satisfying. Suicide remains the most commonly cited possibility. A woman who burned her manuscripts, who had been rejected by the literary world she craved, who was forbidden from living independently, might have walked to the East River and never walked back. The problem is the absence of a body. The East River in December is cold but not swift. Bodies surface. Dorothy's never did. The abortion theory gained traction in the years after her disappearance. Some investigators believed that Dorothy was pregnant, possibly by George Griscom, and that she sought an illegal procedure that resulted in her death. The evidence for this is circumstantial. Her relationship with Griscom, the secrecy surrounding it, the family's desperate effort to keep the case quiet. But no physician was ever identified, and no body was ever found. Murder for money is another possibility, though it seems the least likely. Dorothy had $30 in her pocket. In 1910, that was not an insignificant sum, but it was hardly enough to motivate a killing in broad daylight on Fifth Avenue. And then there is the theory that she planned it, that Dorothy Arnold, meticulous and desperate, engineered her own disappearance, that she walked into the crowd with $30 and a plan and became someone else entirely. A woman in a boarding house, a teacher in a small town, a wife under a new name in a country where no one could prove she had ever been Dorothy Arnold. The fact that she bought chocolates and a book on the day she vanished is cited by proponents of this theory. These were not the purchases of a woman planning to die. These were the purchases of a woman planning to live somewhere else, as someone else. There is one more theory, less discussed and more disturbing. In 1911, a man named Edward Draper told investigators he had paid $250 to have Dorothy killed. Draper was a known criminal with a history of violence. His claim was investigated but never substantiated. No body was found. No corroborating witnesses came forward. Draper recanted and then reasserted his claim multiple times. The police eventually dismissed him as unreliable, but his story lingered in the case files like smoke from a fire no one could find. The family never learned the truth. The Arnold family's silence on the matter was so complete that Dorothy's great-niece reportedly learned of her existence from a newspaper column decades after the disappearance. The brownstone on East 79th Street was eventually sold. The family's name faded from the social register. The perfume fortune dissipated across generations. By the middle of the 20th century, the Arnolds were no longer a family of wealth or influence. They were simply the family that had lost Dorothy. Dorothy Arnold's case remains the oldest active missing person file in New York City. She became a ghost not because she died, but because her family chose to bury the question of what happened to her. The silence they imposed in those first 6 weeks, the silence they chose over the messiness of a public search, became permanent. And in the end, the family got exactly what they feared most. Not scandal, not exposure, nothingness. Chapter 11. Sightings, Phantoms, and the Woman Who Would Not Stay Dead. For 3 decades after the fire, people kept seeing Belle Gunness. In Chicago, in Los Angeles, in the face of every tall, heavy-set woman who smiled a little too knowingly. The sightings began almost immediately. In 1909, a year after the LaPorte fire, a woman matching Belle's description was reported in a small town in Mississippi. Investigators followed the lead. It went nowhere. In 1913, a woman in New York was detained on suspicion of being Belle. She was not. In 1916, a farmer in Wisconsin swore he had seen Belle working as a housekeeper on a neighboring property. The housekeeper turned out to be a Norwegian immigrant who had never been to Indiana. The most dramatic sighting came in 1931 when a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles on charges of poisoning a man for his money. Carlson was elderly, heavy-set, and Scandinavian. The method was poison. The motive was insurance money. Several people who had known Belle Gunness in LaPorte examined photographs of Carlson and said the resemblance was striking. But Carlson died before she could be tried, and the connection was never confirmed. In 2007, nearly a century after the fire, forensic scientists attempted to settle the question. The body found in the basement of the Gunness farmhouse had been buried in a local cemetery. Researchers exhumed remains and attempted DNA testing, comparing the samples to a known descendant of Belle Gunness. The results were inconclusive. The samples were too degraded to provide a definitive answer. The question that had haunted LaPorte for 100 years remained unanswered. Belle Gunness became something more than a criminal. She became an American phantom, a figure who existed in the space between fact and fear. Every tall woman, every heavy woman, every immigrant woman who lived quietly and kept to herself. For decades, and any one of them could have been Belle. The LaPorte Historical Society maintained a file on reported sightings that grew thicker with each passing year. Letters arrived from across the country. I saw her in a market in Portland. I saw her on a streetcar in St. Louis. I saw her face in a crowd in Denver, and she looked right through me. The letters were earnest, detailed, and almost certainly wrong. But they spoke to something deeper than a desire to solve a crime. They spoke to the fear that a woman capable of what Belle had done could be anywhere, could be anyone, could be standing right behind you in the line at the grocer's. The Gunness farm itself became a landmark of horror. The property changed hands several times. No one could farm it successfully. The soil that had hidden the dead seemed to repel the living. The locals avoided the stretch of McClung Road after dark. Children dared each other to walk past the property line. The house was never rebuilt. The cellar hole filled with rainwater and weeds and slowly became indistinguishable from the surrounding fields. But the stories never stopped. 1,000 miles east, Cassie Chadwick's story ended with considerably less mystery and considerably more pathos. She was imprisoned in the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus, where she lived in a cell and ate institutional food. The diamond necklaces were gone. The gold organ was gone. The 30 closets of clothing had been seized and sold. The woman who had spent $72 million in today's money was reduced to a prison uniform and 3 meals a day. She died on October 10th, 1907, her 50th birthday. The prison physician attributed her death to natural causes, noting that her health had been declining for months. A later account, possibly apocryphal, attributed the decline to what the physician delicately called overindulgence in rich food. Whether this meant she had eaten herself to death or simply that her body had broken down under the stress of imprisonment is unclear. She was buried under the name Elizabeth Bigley. Andrew Carnegie, whose name Cassie had used to build her empire of fraud, responded to the affair with characteristic pragmatism. He reimbursed the depositors of the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin who had lost their savings. He then donated the money to build the Carnegie Building at Oberlin College, a structure that still stands. Carnegie turned the scandal into philanthropy, and the philanthropy into a monument. The building bears his name. Cassie Chadwick's name appears nowhere on it. The collateral damage across all 3 cases was enormous. In LaPorte, the Gunness farm left a community traumatized by the discovery that murder had been happening in plain sight for years. The families of Bell's victims, scattered across Scandinavia and the American Midwest, never recovered their dead. In Oberlin, Beckwith's bank failure destroyed family savings that had taken generations to accumulate. In New York, the Arnold family was hollowed out by a silence they had chosen and could not escape. 3 women, 3 different weapons, and the same devastating proof that the systems built to define and contain them were made of paper. Chapter 12. The Freedom of Becoming No One. When census records from the 1890s are filled with women listed as widows whose husbands were very much alive in another state, this is the fact that reframes everything. Dorothy Arnold, Belle Gunness, and Cassie Chadwick are the famous ones. They are the women whose disappearances generated headlines and investigations and theories that persist more than a century later. But they were not alone. They were not even unusual. In an age without identification cards, without databases, without photographs attached to government records, thousands of women simply left. They left abusive husbands. They left controlling families. They left lives that offered no room for the people they wanted to become. They boarded trains and crossed state lines and wrote new names into boarding house registers and started over. No headlines, no investigations, no history. The census enumerator would arrive at a boarding house in Chicago or a rooming house in San Francisco and ask the woman's name. She would give one. He would write it down. He would ask her marital status. Widow, she would say, and he would write that too. No death certificate required. No questions asked. Her husband might be alive and well in Ohio, wondering where his wife had gone. But the census did not check. The census counted. And whatever name you gave the man with the ledger, that was who you were. This is the unnamed army that stands behind every chapter of this story. For every Dorothy Arnold, there were 100 women who vanished with less money and less drama, and no one to notice they were gone. For every Belle Gunness, there were women who fled not from justice, but from injustice, from husbands who beat them, from fathers who controlled them, from a legal system that classified them as property. But the philosophical question this documentary has been building toward is more complicated than a simple celebration of escape. Was freedom under a false name really freedom? Consider what each woman became after she vanished. If Belle Gunness survived the fire, she lived the rest of her life as a fugitive. Every knock on the door was a potential arrest. Every new acquaintance was a potential threat. She could never use her real name, never contact her family, never let her guard down. She had escaped the law, but she had also escaped every connection that makes a life worth living. She was free the way a hunted animal is free. She was alive, but she was running. Cassie Chadwick died in prison as Elizabeth Bigley, not as Cassie, not as Madame Lydia de Vere, not as any of the women she had invented. She died under the name her parents gave her, the name she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. In the end, the original identity was the one the state assigned to her corpse. All the performances, all the costumes, all the borrowed millions, and she was buried under the name of a girl from Eastwood, Ontario, who had never been important enough to notice. Dorothy Arnold became a question mark. She was not a person. She was a case file. She was the oldest unsolved disappearance in New York City, a parlor game for amateur detectives, a footnote in books about Gilded Age society. Her family's silence ensured that she would never be remembered as a writer, as a thinker, as a woman who wanted something more. She would only be remembered as a woman who left. This is the dark truth at the center of the story. Identity in the Gilded Age was a performance sustained by social agreement. Your name was what you told people. Your wealth was what you displayed. Your status was what others believed. These three women, each in her own way, proved that the performance could be ended. You could stop answering to your name. You could walk off the stage. You could disappear. But to destroy every record of who you were is not to become free. It is to become a ghost. You haunt a life that was never fully yours. You drift through rooms that belong to a person who does not exist. You are liberated from every constraint and also from every anchor. No one controls you. No one knows you. No one can say your name and mean it. The law of coverture said that a married woman did not exist. These women took that erasure and turned it into a weapon. They proved the system right in the most terrible way possible. They proved that they could cease to exist. And the world that had built the cage, did not even notice the door was open until long after they were gone. There is a photograph of Dorothy Arnold. She is young. She is looking at the camera with an expression that could be patience or could be resignation. She is wearing a high collar and a dark jacket. She looks exactly like what she was, a well-bred young woman of the early 20th century, groomed for a life she did not want. Somewhere, on a December afternoon in 1910, she stepped off the edge of that photograph and into the crowd, and the crowd swallowed her whole. The chocolates, the book, the fox muff with the white points, the $30 in her pocket, and 100 years of silence. Nobody saw her go.